revelatory note from our sources, we're going to dissect the mechanical innovations that made Ferrari untouchable.
Right, and contrast their absolute stability with the corporate takeovers and financial bankruptcies that were basically ravaging the rest of the world.
Exactly. And we'll examine the subtle regulatory shifts that fundamentally alter the relationship between a driver and their car.
And the reason this matters to you, whether you're a longtime racing fan or just someone fascinated by peak human and mechanical performance, is that 2002 represents a broken point.
A total breaking point.
It demonstrates the paradox of any highly technical competition. I mean, the overarching goal is to achieve absolute perfection. But if you actually attain it, you run the risk of destroying the very environment that gives your success meaning.
That is such a fascinating way to frame it. So let's start by looking at the pure scale of this anomaly. Just how wide was the gap between first place and everyone else?
Oh, Michael Schumacher secured his 5th World Drivers' Championship,
which tied the historic record set by Juan Manuel Fangio in the 1950s, right?
Exactly. It was his 3rd consecutive title with Ferrari. But the numbers attached to this championship are just staggering. He scored 144 points across a 17-race calendar.
Wow.
And to put that in perspective, the previous record was 123 points, which he set himself the year prior.
So he beat his own record by 21 points. That's wild. I want to dig into the timing of this because clinching a global championship with 6 races remaining seems mathematically absurd given the scoring system they had.
It really is a stark reflection of his relentless consistency. At that time, a race victory awarded 10 points.
Okay.
Second place took 6, third took 4, and then trickled down to 1 point for 6th place.
So that 10-point reward for a win was designed to heavily incentivize pushing for the victory rather than just settling.
Right. But when one driver hoards those 10-point payouts week after week, the gap becomes insurmountable very quickly. The championship was decided at the French Grand Prix on July 21st.
In July?
Yes. And the season didn't end until mid-October in Japan.
I'm just trying to wrap my head around the psychological environment of a paddock where the championship is over before the summer break. It's like playing a video game on easy mode with the cheat codes activated.
It really is.
You have thousands of engineers at Williams and McLaren working 80-hour weeks in wind tunnels, analyzing fluid dynamics, sleeping in factories, and by August they're showing up to the track knowing the best they can possibly achieve is effectively a participation trophy.
It creates an incredibly toxic atmosphere for the opposition. In Formula One, motivation is often sustained by the belief that the next aerodynamic upgrade or the next engine mapping tool might unlock the 0.2 of a second you need to close the gap.
Right, there's always that hope.
Exactly. But when the gap isn't 0.2, but an entire second per lap, and the points deficit is already terminal, that motivation just evaporates.
Because what's the point?
Right. The focus shifts entirely to the following year's car, which means you are essentially abandoning the current season while still being legally required to travel the world and compete in it.
But doesn't that make the sport lose its point? I mean, how do fans stay engaged when the ending is already spoiled?
That is the exact problem we'll get to later, because the fans definitely reacted to that lack of tension.
I can imagine. And it wasn't just the sheer number of wins, it was the total absence of failure. Our sources highlight that Schumacher achieved the podium finish when he stood on the steps as first, second, or third in every single race of the season.
Yeah, that is arguably the most insane stat of the year.
Right, out of 17 races, he won 11. He finished second 5 times. And his absolute worst result of the entire year was a single third-place finish in Malaysia.
He remains the only driver in the history of the sport to achieve a 100% podium record in a single season.
That's just unbelievable. And his teammate, Rubens Barrichello, won 4 races.
Right, which meant Ferrari won 15 out of 17 races. That left exactly 2 races for the rest of the world to win.
Ralf Schumacher won in Malaysia, and David Coulthard won in Monaco. That's it.
Which speaks directly to the concept of mechanical reliability. To finish on the podium 17 times out of 17 requires more than just speed. It requires a vehicle that simply does not quit.
Yeah, especially back then.
Exactly. In the early 2000s, engines were highly volatile V10s, revving to nearly 19,000 RPM. Gearboxes shattered constantly. Hydraulics leaked.
It was a very fragile era of cars.
Very fragile. So for a car to survive 17 race weekends, including the intense heat of Malaysia and the brutal curves of Monza, without a single terminal mechanical failure, it's a testament to quality control that was entirely alien to the rest of the grid.
Let's contextualize that against the rest of the field, because it's funny, Ferrari as a constructor finished with 221 points. Their closest rival was Williams BMW, who were armed with a massively powerful engine, and they finished second with 92 points.
Not even close.
Not even close. McLaren Mercedes was third with 65. If you take Williams, McLaren, Renault, Sauber, Jordan, and every other team on the grid and combine their points, Ferrari matched the entire industry combined.
Yeah, it's a terrifying metric. And if you look at Juan Pablo Montoya, who drove for Williams, he finished third in the driver standings with 50 points.
Which is barely a third of Schumacher's total.
Right. And Montoya is a fascinating counterpoint. He was arguably one of the most naturally gifted drivers of his generation. He was known for this incredibly aggressive, instinctual driving style.
Very exciting to watch.
Very. And he was driving a Williams that on certain days was extraordinarily fast over a single qualifying lap. He actually took 7 pole positions.
7 poles, but only 50 points at the end of the year.
Exactly. Because converting a single fast lap into a race distance requires tire management, aerodynamic stability in dirty air, and fuel efficiency. Over 300 kilometers on a Sunday, the Williams would degrade its rear tires, or the engine would suffer a pneumatic valve failure.
So Montoya's 50 points weren't a reflection of lack of time?
No, not at all. They were a reflection of a car that existed on a razor's edge, whereas the Ferrari operated in a massive window of operational safety.
Which brings us to the core mechanism of this dominance. Because drivers don't win in a vacuum. You need the machine to match the man. A driver cannot score 144 points through sheer willpower alone.
Absolutely not. They need a machine capable of translating human inputs into physical grit.
So let's transition into the engineering. The sources outline that Ferrari utilized a highly unusual strategy in 2002. They didn't just show up to the first race with their new car.
Right, they actually used 2 entirely different chassis over the course of the season. The F2001B and the F2002.
For a listener new to racing, can you explain the significance of using a B-spec car from the previous year? Because that seems so counterintuitive. If your rivals are showing up with brand new design aimed at finding their speed, aren't you starting the season at an inherent aerodynamic disadvantage by running a year-old concept?
You'd think so, but this is where we see Ferrari's strategic brilliance. Developing a Formula One car is an exercise in managing risk. Every new chassis introduces hundreds of new variables. You've got new suspension geometries, new cooling requirements, new aerodynamic profiles.
It's essentially a prototype every year.
Exactly, it's a completely bespoke prototype. Most teams rush their new cars to the first race in Australia, hoping the wind tunnel data correlates with the real world. Ferrari chose a path of calculated innovation.
So they didn't want to risk it.
Right. They took their 2001 championship-winning car, upgraded the internal components to meet the 2002 regulations, and called it the F2001B. You are trading ultimate theoretical aerodynamic peak for absolute proven reliability.
Wow.
Ferrari knew that their F2001 was a known quantity. They knew exactly how it reacted to slight changes. They had gigabytes of data on how it wore its tires.
So while Williams and McLaren spent the first 3 races of 2002 diagnosing overheating issues and chasing setup gremlins on their brand new cars, Ferrari was just capitalizing on perfect reliability.
Exactly. Schumacher actually won the season opener in Australia in the old F2001B.
That is wild. It's essentially letting your opponents beta test their own equipment in public while you use a perfectly patched operating system.
That's a great analogy.
But you know, they couldn't run the old car forever.
Isn't it an incredible risk to introduce a brand new chassis like the F2002 after the season has already started? Especially if you are already winning with the old one. It is a massive risk. But the introduction of the F2002, midway through the early calendar, demonstrates Ferrari's immense developmental resources. They were winning with last year's equipment, biding their time until the F2002 was perfectly refined at their private test track.
And from what I'm reading, the F2002 wasn't just an iteration. It was a fundamental rethinking of how the back half of a racing car was constructed. Let's break down the mechanics of the F2002 for someone who might not understand fluid dynamics. What made this car so devastating?
The genius of the F2002 lay in its packaging, specifically at the rear of the car. Aerodynamics in Formula One is largely about managing the air that flows under and around the rear wheels.
Okay.
The cleaner that airflow, the more the car is sucked down onto the track, creating downforce. To maximize that airflow, Ferrari needed to shrink the physical footprint of the engine and the gearbox.
So they had to make the guts of the car smaller.
Exactly. They developed a brand new, ultra-compact gearbox casing cast from titanium, which was incredibly light and stiff.
So by making the gearbox smaller, they could literally pull the carbon fiber bodywork tighter around the rear of the car, like a corset.
Yeah, exactly like the corset. It's known as a size 0 rear end, or a tight Coke bottle shape. Because the gearbox and the rear suspension mounting points were so compact, the aerodynamicists had a massive, unobstructed pathway to channel high-speed air over the rear diffuser.
That's brilliant.
And furthermore, they pioneered a specific type of exhaust route, periscope exhaust, that exited from the top of the side plates. This blew hot, energized exhaust gases over the aerodynamic elements to generate even more downforce.
But that requires immense coordination, right? I mean, the engine department is building a 3.0 liter naturally aspirated V10, the TIPO 051, which produces astronomical heat. And the gearbox department is shrinking the casing, reducing the surface area for cooling, and then the aerodynamicists are demanding everything be packaged tighter than ever before. If any one of those departments fails, doesn't the car just melt itself from the inside out?
It absolutely would. And that synergy is what separated Ferrari from Williams and McLaren. Williams had the BMW P82 engine, which was widely acknowledged to be the most powerful engine on the grid in 2002, producing well over 900 horsepower in qualifying trim.
Oh, wow.
But Williams built the chassis in England, while BMW built the engine in Germany. There were two separate corporate cultures trying to integrate complex machinery.
Which sounds like a nightmare for communication.
It was. Ferrari, on the other hand, built the chassis, the engine, and the gearbox all under one roof in Maranello, Italy. They could design the engine block to act as a stressed member of the chassis, perfectly complementing the suspension geometry.
Let's add another layer to this synergy, the tires. Because all that horsepower and aerodynamic downforce is utterly useless if the 4 patches of rubber touching the asphalt can't handle the load.
Tires are everything.
Right. And the tire war in 2002 was a massive defining factor. Williams and McLaren were running on Michelin tires, while Ferrari was on Bridgestone. But Ferrari's relationship with Bridgestone wasn't just as a regular customer, was it?
No, it was a totally bespoke partnership. While Michelin was trying to supply a tire that worked reasonably well for a variety of different chassis concepts across multiple teams, Ferrari essentially acted as Bridgestone's primary development partner.
So they were getting VIP treatment.
Beyond VIP, Bridgestone engineers were actually embedded in Maranello. They designed the sidewall stiffness, the compound degradation rates, and the thermal properties of the rubber specifically to match the weight distribution and suspension kinematics of the F2002.
So when Schumacher turned the steering wheel, the mechanical load transfer of the suspension was perfectly anticipated by the structural flex of the Bridgestone tire. It's basically a closed-loop development cycle.
Precisely. If the F2002 had a slight tendency toward understeer in medium-speed corners, Bridgestone would literally manufacture a front tire profile to dial out that exact characteristic.
That's insane.
It was a level of integration that independent teams simply could not replicate. They had to take whatever tire compound was delivered on Thursday and adapt their car to it. Ferrari had the tire adapted to their car months in advance.
Wow. And this contrast between Ferrari's monolithic, vertically integrated stability and the rest of the grid's fragmented reality leads perfectly into our next area of focus. While Ferrari had the luxury of a stable, perfectly iterating team, the rest of the grid was undergoing massive structural and roster upheaval.
Yeah, the off-season heading into 2002 saw a huge changing of the guard. It was driven by massive corporate interests and the departure of key human capital.
Yeah, let's talk about the preseason musical chairs. Because the most significant departure was Mika Häkkinen, right? He was the world champion in 1998 and 1999, driving from McLaren.
Right, and for years he was the only driver who possessed the raw pace and the psychological resilience to consistently fight Michael Schumacher on equal footing.
But the mental toll of that rivalry, combined with a few severe accidents over his career, led him to announce a quote-unquote sabbatical at the end of 2001.
A sabbatical that ultimately became a permanent retirement from Formula 1.
Right, and when a titan like Häkkinen steps away from a team like McLaren, it doesn't just leave an empty seat, it leaves an experiential vacuum. You lose a driver who knows exactly how to guide the development of the car.
Exactly. So McLaren was forced to pivot aggressively. They recruited a young, highly talented Finnish driver, Kimi Räikkönen. He actually bought him right out of his contract himself.
Which had to cost a fortune.
It did. Räikkönen was blisteringly fast, but he was incredibly young, with only 1 year of Formula 1 experience. Putting a sophomore driver into a championship contending seat, tasked with filling the void left by a double world champion, introduces an inherent instability to a team development program.
Definitely. And there were other driver swaps too, right? Like Giancarlo Fisichella and Ronald Trilli orchestrated a straight seat swap between Benetton and Gordon.
Yeah, it was just constant shuffling.
But the instability wasn't just about drivers, it was about the fundamental corporate structure of the midfield. We see a massive shift in ownership detailed in our sources. The Benetton team, which had a really rich history in the sport, completely vanished from the name. They were rebranded entirely as the Renault F1 team.
This is a crucial macroeconomic shift in the sports history. For decades, Formula One had been populated by Gardistas, independent racing teams like Williams, McLaren, and Benetton, who built their own chassis and leased engines from external manufacturers.
So they were basically specialized racing outfits.
Right. But by 2002, major global automakers realized the marketing potential of Formula One. Renault, a massive French conglomerate, didn't just want to supply engines anymore, they wanted full control. They had purchased Benetton in 2000, and by 2002, they had fully integrated the operation into a works team.
Can you explain what a works team means in terms of competitive advantage and financial scale? Because that term gets thrown around a lot.
Yeah, so a works team owns the entire intellectual property of the car, from the front wing to the exhaust button. They design the engine and the chassis concurrently, with a budget underwritten by a global automotive company. And we're often talking hundreds of millions of dollars annually. It basically mirrors the Ferrari model. Renault realized that to beat Ferrari, you had to emulate their vertical integration.
And Renault wasn't the only giant waking up. We also saw the arrival of Toyota. And they didn't even bother buying an existing team. They built an entire operation from the ground up in Cologne, Germany, entering as a brand new full works team in 2002 with Mika Salo and Alan McNish.
Which was a huge deal. Toyota's entry was a stark warning to the independent teams. They arrived with one of the largest budgets in the history of the sport. They actually spent the entirety of 2001 just testing their prototype TF101 car at tracks around the world, completely detached from the racing calendar, just gathering data.
That is such a flex. Just running a ghost team for a year to practice.
Right. And they debuted in 2002 with the TF102. Their mere presence aggressively inflated the cost of competing. They were hiring away top aerodynamicists and engineers by offering corporate salaries that independent teams just couldn't match.
That economic pressure squeezed the midfield teams intensely, and you can see it in the frantic scramble for engine leases. The sources highlight a crazy domino effect. The engine supplier Asiatech left the Arrows team to supply Minardi.
Right.
So Arrows, suddenly left without a powertrain, managed to strike a deal with Cosworth. These aren't minor logistical tweaks. If you change your engine supplier in December, your entire chassis design is suddenly compromised, right?
Oh, really compromised. The chassis has to be designed around the specific mounting points, the cooling requirements, and the center of gravity of the engine. If a midfield team loses their engine supplier late in the development cycle, they have to physically cut and modify the carbon fiber tub to shoehorn a different V10 into the back.
Oh, that sounds like a disaster for aerodynamics.
It is. It ruins the aerodynamic philosophy of the car. This constant state of survival mode, just trying to secure the physical components to go racing, prevented teams like Arrows and Minardi from ever establishing the long-term development cycles necessary to meet up the grid.
And it's into this exact pressure cooker, a grid transitioning into a battleground for global automakers, where independent teams are fighting for scraps that a new generation of rookies was creating. Let's look at the drivers who made their debut in the deep end in 2002. Specifically, Felipe Massa and
The transition from junior categories to Formula One is always a shock to the system. In 2002, the cars were immensely difficult to drive. Felipe Massa arrived as the reigning Euro Formula 3000 champion and took the seat at Sauber that had just been vacated by Kimi Räikkönen.
which, as we discussed, is an immense psychological burden. Räikkönen was highly touted enough to become famous. Massa steps into that exact seat, driving for Peter Sauber, a team principal known for demanding immediate results. It's like stepping onto a treadmill that is already running at 20 miles per hour while someone throws wrenches at you.
That is very accurate. Massa had the raw speed, but he had to learn the brutal realities of Formula One tire management and racecraft in real time.
And it was a bumpy ride for him that year.
It was. But the most revealing rookie performance of the year probably belonged to Mark Webber. Webber, who had been a runner-up in International F3000, debuted from Minardi, replacing Fernando Alonso, who became a Renault test driver.
And Minardi holds a very specific place in F1 history, right? They were incredibly beloved by fans, but they were perennial backwards. They operated on a fraction of Ferrari's budget.
A tiny fraction. And Webber's debut at the season opener of the Australian Grand Prix, which was his home race, is just a masterclass in driving machinery beyond its engineering limits.
Oh yeah, he scored 2 points right out of the gate.
Exactly. He was driving the Minardi PSO2, powered by that AG Tech engine we mentioned earlier. It was a heavy, aerodynamically inefficient car. Yet, through a race of high attrition, Webber managed to navigate the chaos and bring the car home in 5th place.
Which, under the 10-6-4-3-2-1 point system, meant he scored 2 World Championship points on his debut. I want to emphasize how incredibly difficult it was to score points in a Minardi.
It was a monumental achievement.
You aren't just fighting the other drivers, you are fighting the physical limitations of the car that wants to shake itself apart over 58 laps. He actually had to defend his position against Mika Salo in the heavily funded, brand new Toyota in the closing stages of the race.
And defending against a works Toyota in a customer Minardi requires immense spatial awareness and defensive driving skill. Webber had to perfectly place his car on the apex of every corner to deny Salo a slipstream opportunity.
That must have been so tense on the pit wall.
Oh, they were losing their minds. Those 2 points were celebrated like a race victory by Paul Stoddart, the Minardi team owner, because scoring points meant an influx of crucial television revenue at the end of the year.
It's a brilliant human achievement, but the cars that Webber and Massa were wrestling with were fundamentally evolving beneath them. The 2002 season wasn't just defined by aerodynamics and corporate buyouts, it was defined by some subtle but game-changing regulatory shifts mandated by the FIA. Let's analyze the invisible hands shaping the sport.
The regulations introduced in 2002 addressed 2 distinct areas: physical safety and electronic data transfer.
Okay, let's start with safety.
If we address the physical regulations first, the FIA mandated larger rear view mirrors and larger rear lights for visibility in rain.
Which seems minor, but reflects a continuous creeping evolution in F1 safety protocols.
Right. But more importantly, they introduced significantly stricter impact tests on the rear crash structure of the cars.
How does a stricter impact test change the physical design of the car? The teams don't just, bolt on a thicker piece of metal, right?
No, definitely not. In Formula One, everything is constructed from carbon fiber composite. Carbon fiber doesn't bend like steel. It is designed to shatter and delaminate, absorbing kinetic energy as it breaks apart, thereby protecting the driver in the central survival zone.
So it absorbs the shock by destroying itself.
Exactly. So to meet stricter rear impact tests, engineers had to design rear structures that could absorb more joules of energy upon impact with a barrier. This usually means adding length or volume to the crash structure.
Which inherently disrupts the aerodynamic airflow the engineers are trying so desperately to optimize.
Bingo. It's a constant tug of war between safety mandates and aerodynamic efficiency.
That makes total sense. The FIA forces the safety parameter, and the aerodynamicists have to design a way to claw back the downforce lost to that parameter.
Right.
But the second regulatory change in 2002 is the massive shift, the one that really challenges the philosophy of motorsport.
And telemetry.
Yes. The legalization of two-way data transfer between the car and the garage.
This was a genuine paradigm shift in the sport's history. To understand its impact, we need to look at how data operated prior to 2002. Historically, telemetry was a one-way street. The car was fitted with hundreds of sensors measuring suspension travel, exhaust temperatures, tire pressures, brake wear, all of it.
Right.
That data was broadcast continuously to the engineers sitting on the pit wall. The pit wall could see exactly what the car was doing, but they couldn't physically intervene. If they saw the engine was running too hot, they had to radio the driver, and the driver had to manually turn a dial on the steering wheel to change the fuel mixture.
So the car was like a body that could feel pain but couldn't react. It sent data to the brain in the pit lane, but the brain had to shout instructions back to the driver, the hands, to fix the problem.
That is an excellent structural metaphor. The driver was the manual executor of the engineer's commands. But in 2002, the FIA legalized two-way data transfer.
Which changes everything.
It means the signal could flow back from the pit wall directly into the car's electronic control unit. The engineers became the subconscious nervous system. They could remotely reach into the car and alter its parameters without the driver ever consciously knowing it was happening.
See, I'm struggling with the theoretical boundary of this. If an engineer sitting in an air-conditioned garage with a laptop can change the differential locking mechanism while the car is doing 200 mph mid-corner to cure understeer, is the driver just a passenger? Doesn't that take the romance out of racing?
It definitely sparked a huge ethical debate.
And doesn't that contradict the FIA's own long-standing regulations against driver aids? How do they justify legalizing this if things like active suspension have historically been banned for doing exactly that?
It operated in the semantic gray area of the regulations. The FIA drew a distinction between closed-loop systems and open-loop systems.
Okay, what's the difference?
A closed-loop system, like traction control, uses a computer in the car to instantly detect wheel spin and cut engine power autonomously. That is a direct driver aid. An open-loop system in the eyes of the FIA in 2002 meant the engineer was analyzing data and making a macro adjustment to the engine map.
Oh, I see.
It wasn't the car reacting autonomously to a loss of grip. It was a human engineer optimizing a setting.
But the practical result is that a driver's mistakes can be masked, right? If a driver is too aggressive on the throttle and overheating the rear tires, the engineer can remotely dial back the torque delivery in the lower gears to smooth out the acceleration. That saves the tires and saves the driver from their own lack of finesse.
Exactly. It certainly lowered the premium on pure, unassisted car control. It shifted Formula One from being purely a driver versus machine endeavor into a remote engineering exercise. The pit crew became virtual co-pilots.
And obviously, the teams with the largest computing budgets and the fastest data processing capabilities gained a massive advantage.
Which means Ferrari, with their unlimited resources, mastered this two-way telemetry perfectly.
Right. Which brings us to the most tragic contrast of the year, because having a cutting-edge remote control central nervous system in your car is entirely irrelevant if your team physically runs out of money to keep the lights on.
Yeah, it's a brutal reality.
While Ferrari was playing 4D chess with telemetry and titanium, the back of the grid was in a fight for its life. Let's talk about the chaos, financial ruin, and the bizarre driver drama that defined the bottom half of the 2002 standings.
The macroeconomic climate of Formula One in 2002 was unforgiving. F1 in 2002 was a brutally expensive sport. The influx of corporate manufacturer money drove the cost of competition to unsustainable levels for independent teams. And the first casualty occurred before the season even began. In January of 2002, Prost Grand Prix was placed into liquidation.
And Prost Grand Prix was not a startup. This team carried the legacy of the Équipe Légère outfit, which had been racing since the 1970s. It was owned by Alain Prost, a four-time world champion. It was a French national institution. How does a team with that pedigree just vanish into the wind?
They just ran out of commercial runway. The cost of leasing customer engines, in their case, from Acer, which were basically rebadged older Ferrari engines, combined with a lack of major sponsorship, created insurmountable debt.
That's heartbreaking.
The receivers liquidated the assets. Their designated car numbers, 18 and 19, remained unoccupied for the entire year.
But the death of the team triggered a bizarre legal battle. Our sources mention a company called Phoenix Finance that tried to resurrect the corpse of Prost Grand Prix.
Yeah, this was wild. Phoenix Finance purchased the physical assets of Prost, the chassis, the computers, the tooling, from the liquidators. They then showed up at the second round of the championship, the Malaysian Grand Prix, with two former minority drivers, Gaston Mazepin and Tarso Marquez, and declared their intention to race.
Wait, you can't just buy a used Formula One car, show up at a circuit, and demand a garage sales. There has to be a legal framework that governs who is allowed to participate in a multi-billion-dollar sporting event.
There is, and it's called the Concord Agreement. The FIA and the Formula One Management Group immediately blocked Phoenix Finance. The ruling was legally precise. Phoenix had purchased the physical assets, but they had not purchased the actual entry, the franchise rights of the Prost team.
Ah, I see.
The entry rights are non-transferable without the consent of the governing body and the other teams. Despite Phoenix taking the matter to the High Court, race officials physically locked them out of the circuit. It was a stark demonstration that in modern F1, a team is defined by its legal franchise, not its physical cars.
That is so crazy. And the contagion of bankruptcy continued mid-season, right? Arrows, a team that had been competing since 1978, began to slowly suffocate in public view.
Arrow's demise was a protracted, agonizing process. They managed to fund their operations for the first half of the year, but by the summer they were missing payments to their engine supplier, Cosworth.
Which is never a good sign.
Never. At the French Grand Prix, they deliberately failed to qualify to avoid wearing out parts they couldn't afford to replace, while still technically fulfilling their contractual obligation to show up.
Oh, wow. So they just drove too slow on purpose.
Yeah, just to tick the box that they attended. Following the German Grand Prix in late July, the money completely dried up. They missed the remaining 5 races of the season and subsequently went into liquidation.
This financial collapse created massive collateral damage for the humans employed by these teams. Imagine being a driver, risking your life at 200 miles per hour, but you aren't sure if your team will exist on Monday morning.
It's an insane amount of pressure.
The saga of Heinz-Harald Frentzen is the perfect encapsulation of this chaos, because he went on quite the journey in 2002.
Frentzen's 2002 season is a masterpiece of survival and political maneuvering. He was driving for Prost in 2001. When Prost collapsed in January, he was suddenly unemployed. He managed to scramble and secure a seat at Arrows.
Okay, so out of the frying pan.
Into the fire. He drove the Arrows, knowing the team was bleeding out, up until the German Grand Prix. Realizing the ship was sinking, he terminated his contract and walked away. Days later, Arrows formally collapsed.
So he escapes the first bankruptcy, only to get caught in the second, and is unemployed again by August. That is brutal.
But then he gets a call from Sauber for the United States Grand Prix in September. And this is where the pure, cynical brilliance of Formula One politics comes into play. Sauber didn't hire Frentzen out of the goodness of their hearts. They hired him to exploit a regulatory loophole.
Oh, I love this part. Let's break down this loophole. Sauber's regular driver was the rookie we talked about, Felipe Massa. At the previous race in Monza, Massa had caused a collision and was handed a 10-position grid penalty for the next race in the United States.
Exactly. A 10-position grid penalty means that wherever you qualify, you start 10 places further back. It effectively ruins your weekend. But the regulations stated the penalty applied to the driver, not the car.
Wait, really?
Yes. So Sauber realized that if they benched Massa for the US Grand Prix and put Frentzen in the car, Frentzen would have no penalty.
So they essentially used Frentzen as a regulatory sponge to absorb and erase Massa's penalty.
Pretty much.
Massa sits on the sidelines for one weekend, the penalty vanishes into the ether, Frentzen gets to showcase his skills in a decent car, and Sauber avoids starting from the back of the grid. That is an astonishing manipulation of the rule.
It was perfectly legal, albeit highly simple. And Frentzen performed well enough that Sauber actually signed him for the full 2003 season, replacing Massa entirely. It shows how quickly fortunes can change when drivers are treated as interchangeable assets.
The desperation wasn't limited to dodging penalties, though. Some teams were just desperate to find drivers who could legally operate the machinery. Which brings us back to Minardi. While Mark Webber was performing miracles on one side of the garage, the other side was, well, a disaster.
Yeah, Minardi's second seat was occupied by Alex Young, whose seat was heavily subsidized by Malaysian sponsors. Formula One operates with a safety net called the 107% rule. During qualifying, every driver must set a lap time that is within 107% of the pole position time. If you are slower than that margin, you are deemed too slow to safely participate in the race, and you fail to qualify.
Which makes sense. It prevents mobile chicanes from being on the track when leaders are approaching at 200 miles per hour.
Precisely. Well, Alex Young failed to meet that 107% threshold at 3 separate events: San Marino, Britain, and Germany. Following the German Grand Prix, Minardi suspended him to protect both him and the car. They desperately needed a replacement for the upcoming races in Hungary and Belgium.
And this leads to my absolute favorite, most bizarre engineering fact of the entire 2002 season. Minardi identified their ideal replacement, Justin Wilson. He was a highly rated British driver, but they couldn't hire him, not because he lacked sponsorship or talent, but because of the physical impossibility.
Yeah, Justin Wilson was 6 feet 4 inches tall.
Which is very tall for a race car driver.
In the context of a modern Formula One car, that is a structural disqualification. As we discussed earlier with the crash structures, a Formula One cockpit is a bespoke carbon fiber survival cell. It is molded incredibly tightly around the dimensions of an average-sized driver to minimize aerodynamic drag.
It is essentially a carbon fiber sleeping bag. I mean, if your shoulders are too broad, they hit the sides of the tub. If your legs are too long, your knees strike the underside of the steering column.
Which is exactly what happened. When Wilson attempted a seat fitting in the Minardi PSO2, he physically could not operate the pedals without his knees interfering with the steering wheel. Furthermore, his helmet sat too high relative to the roll hoop.
Oh, that's dangerous.
Very dangerous. Meaning, in the event of an inversion, his head would bear the weight of the car rather than the structural roll bar. Because the carbon fiber tub is a homologated crash-tested structure, Minardi couldn't simply cut a hole in it to give him more legroom. Wilson was literally physically barred by the engineering constraints of the car.
So what did they do?
Minardi had to pivot and hire Anthony Davidson, a much shorter test driver, for those 2 races.
That is just wild. So we have spent the last hour painting 2 entirely polarized realities that coexisted in the same paddock. On one end, Michael Schumacher is wrapping up a championship in July, driving a flawlessly optimized F2002, supported by bespoke tires and remote telemetry.
Yep.
On the other end, teams are going bankrupt, leveraging legal loopholes to dodge penalties, and rejecting drivers because their femurs are 3 inches too long for the carbon tub.
It's a massive contrast.
When you smash these two realities together, it creates a breaking point for the sport as a whole. Let's examine the ultimate ripple effects of 2002, a season that literally changed F1.
The crisis manifested commercially. Formula One is, above all else, a global media product, heavily reliant on television rights and sponsorships. In 2002, they faced an external threat and an internal threat.
Okay, let's start with the external threat.
The external threat was the 2002 FIFA World Cup, which was held jointly in Japan and South Korea.
Time zones. The time zones for a World Cup in Asia meant the matches were broadcasting directly during the European afternoon, which is the exact traditional time slot for European Formula One races.
Exactly. To avoid a catastrophic clash in television viewership, the FIA was forced to completely alter the historical calendar, swapping the dates of the French Grand Prix and the British Grand Prix.
Wow.
It was a humbling moment, proving that even a massive entity like F1 has to bend to the gravitational pull of the World Cup.
But the World Cup was a temporary external anomaly. The internal threat was far more dangerous. The internal threat was that Schumacher and Ferrari's unprecedented domination led directly to a decline in television viewing figures. They had successfully engineered all of the suspense out of the broadcast.
Exactly. Perfection is an incredible engineering feat, but it is a terrible narrative problem. If the global audience knows with absolute certainty that Schumacher is going to win and that he will finish the season 67 points ahead of his own teammate, the dramatic tension evaporates.
Think about your favorite sport. If one team wins every game by a landslide, you eventually change the channel. Why tune in for 2 hours on a Sunday to watch a foregone conclusion?
In professional sports, a decline in viewership is an existential threat. It devalues trackside advertising, it lowers the asking price for television rights, and it threatens the survival of the smaller teams that rely on a share of that revenue. The FIA realized that they had to intervene.
They couldn't just let it happen.
No, they could not allow another season of uncontested dominance, so they initiated a massive overhaul of a championship's sporting regulations for 2003.
So they basically had to introduce artificial constraints to punish Ferrari's success. What did they change?
They overhauled the qualifying format, introducing a single-lap shootout system that heavily penalized any minor driver error, aiming to mix up the starting grid. They implemented strict parc fermé rules, meaning teams could no longer completely rebuild and tune the cars between qualifying and the race, neutralizing Ferrari's massive logistical advantage. And most significantly, they altered the point system from 10-6-4-3-2-1 to 10-8-6-5-4-3-2-1.
Oh, I see. So by closing the gap between first and second place from 4 points to just 2 points, they mathematically ensured that a driver couldn't run away with the championship just by winning the early races?
Exactly. They designed a point system specifically engineered to keep the title fight alive deeper into the calendar.
Ferrari's brilliance literally forced the governing body to rewrite the economic and sporting structure of Formula One.
It really did.
We set out today to deconstruct the mechanics of the 2002 Formula One World Championship, and what we found was a story of systemic disruption.
Two distinct realities.
Right. At the front, we saw unprecedented stability, the triumph of total vertical integration. The F2002 chassis, the Tipo 051 engine, the Bridgestone tires, and the two-way telemetry systems all functioning as a single, devastatingly optimized organism.
And back, bankruptcy, desperate driver swaps, and the brutal reality of an industry transitioning from independent garagistas to corporate monoliths, leaving a trail of liquidations and guys who were just too tall to drive in its wake.
It is a season that started with a flawless victory in Australia and ended with the sport realizing it had to actively sabotage its own champion to survive.
Which leaves you with a critical concept to consider long after this deep dive ends.
What's that?
The 2002 season proved that in motorsport, absolute, flawless engineering perfection is the ultimate goal of the competitor, but it is the absolute worst possible outcome for the spectator. If the FIA hadn't stepped in to drastically overhaul the rules for 2003, inserting artificial chaos back into the system, we have to ask, would Formula One have survived its own pursuit of perfection.
It makes you wonder how many other industries are secretly relying on inefficiency just to keep the game interesting. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep analyzing those sources, keep exploring the fascinating history hidden within your own reading materials, and we'll catch you on the next one. By the third week of July 2002, the Formula One World Championship was, mathematically over.
Completely done.
Right. Millions of dollars were still sitting in team budgets, just waiting to be spent. Hundreds of mechanics were still prepping to ship thousands of tons of freight to races in Hungary, Belgium, Italy, Japan.
Yeah, the physical circus of the sport was legally mandated to continue for another 3 months.
Exactly. But mathematically, the war was already lost. One man, driving a machine so flawlessly optimized it bordered on science fiction, had completely broken the math of the sport.
Broken so badly they had to step in.
Yeah, the sheer gravity of what Scuderia Ferrari achieved that year didn't just defeat their competitors. It actually forced the governing body of global motorsport to rewrite the rulebook just to, manufacture a sense of competition again.
It really is the ultimate case study in what happens when systems engineering completely outstrips the surrounding ecosystem.
Oh, for sure.
We tend to view professional sports through this lens of human rivalry, an ebb and flow of momentum. But 2002 wasn't a rivalry. It was an exhibition of industrial dominance.
A total exhibition. Welcome to the deep dive. Today we are taking a forensic look at the 2002 FIA Formula One World Championship.
And we've got a lot of ground to cover.
We really do. Our mission today is to unpack exactly how that dominance was engineered. By synthesizing the historical data, team rosters, and regulatory notes from our sources, we're going to dissect the mechanical innovations that made Ferrari untouchable.
Right, and contrast their absolute stability with the corporate takeovers and financial bankruptcies that were basically ravaging the rest of the grid.
Exactly. And we'll examine the subtle regulatory shifts that fundamentally altered the relationship between a driver and their car.
And the reason this matters to you, whether you're a longtime racing fan or just someone fascinated by peak human and mechanical performance, is that 2002 represents a breaking point.
A total breaking point.
It demonstrates the paradox of any highly technical competition. The overarching goal is to achieve absolute perfection, right? But if you actually attain it, you run the risk of destroying the very environment that gives your success meaning.
That is such a fascinating way to frame it. So let's start by looking at the pure scale of this anomaly. Just how wide was the gap between first place and everyone else?
Oh, Michael Schumacher secured his 5th World Drivers' Championship that year.
Which tied the historic record set by Ron Fangio in the 1950s. Right?
Exactly. It was his 3rd consecutive title with Ferrari. But the numbers attached to this championship are just staggering. He scored 144 points across a 17-race calendar.
Wow.
And to put that in perspective, the previous record was 123 points, which he set himself the year prior.
So he beat his own record by 21 points. That's wild. I want to dig into the timing of this because clinching a global championship with 6 races remaining seems mathematically absurd given the scoring system they had back then.
It really is a stark reflection of his relentless consistency. At that time, a race victory awarded 10 points.
Okay.
Second place took 6, third took 4, and then it trickled down to 1 point for 6th place.
So that 10-point reward for a win was designed to heavily incentivize pushing for the victory rather than just settling.
Right. But when one driver hoards those 10-point payouts week after week, the gap becomes insurmountable very quickly. The championship was decided at the French Grand Prix on July 21st.
In July?
Yes. And the season didn't end until mid-October in Japan.
I'm just trying to wrap my head around the psychological environment of a paddock where the championship is over before the summer break. It's like playing a video game on easy mode with the cheat codes activated.
It really is.
You have thousands of engineers at Williams and McLaren working 80-hour weeks in wind tunnels, analyzing fluid dynamics, sleeping in factories, and by August they are showing up to the track knowing the best they can possibly achieve is effectively a participation trophy.
It creates an incredibly toxic atmosphere for the opposition. In Formula One, motivation is often sustained by the belief that, the next aerodynamic upgrade or the next engine mapping tweak might unlock the 0.2 of a second you need to close the gap.
Right, there's always that hope.
Exactly. But when the gap isn't 0.2, but an entire second per lap, and the points deficit is already terminal, that motivation just evaporates.
Because what's the point?
Right. The focus shifts entirely to the following year's car, which means you are essentially abandoning the current season while still being legally required to travel the world and compete in it.
But doesn't that make the sport lose its point? I mean, how do fans stay engaged when the ending is already spoiled?
That is the exact problem we'll get to later, because the fans definitely reacted to that lack of tension.
I can imagine. And it wasn't just the sheer number of wins, it was the total absence of failure. Our sources highlight that Schumacher achieved the podium finish, meaning he stood on the steps as first, second, or third in every single race of the season.
Yeah, that is arguably the most insane stat of the year.
Right, out of 17 races, he won 11. He finished second 5 times, and his absolute worst result of the entire year was a single third-place finish in Malaysia.
He remains the only driver in the history of the sport to achieve a 100% podium record in a single season.
That's just unbelievable. And his teammate, Rubens Barrichello, won 4 races.
Right, which meant Ferrari won 15 out of 17 races. That left exactly 2 races for the rest of the world to win.
Ralf Schumacher won in Malaysia, and David Coulthard won in Monaco. That's it.
Which speaks directly to the concept of mechanical reliability. To finish on the podium 17 times out of 17 requires more than just speed. It requires a vehicle that simply does not break.
Yeah, especially back then.
Exactly. In the early 2000s, engines were highly volatile V10s, revving to nearly 19,000 RPM. Gearboxes shattered constantly. Hydraulics leaked.
It was a very fragile era of cars.
Very fragile. So for a car to survive 17 race